and to say that just thank you so much to everyone for being here, for taking the time to be part of today's presentation on carbon literacy and climate awareness, which is the first of two workshops focused on empowering climate action in tourism. This first workshop will touch upon some of the impacts and opportunities of climate change in tourism. So our goal here is to really distill what does climate change mean and what are some of those drivers towards climate change and how does that have an impact on the tourism industry, and really to learn about how are other organizations, and I'm sure there's many examples here as well of how your own organizations have also gone about enhancing sustainability in your operations and taking action on climate change. So really distilling those concepts. What does it mean to be a carbon neutral business? How do you achieve net zero? And how do you decarbonize as a business, and what does that pathway look like? We're going to aim to distill all of those definitions as best as we can today, as well as sharing those case studies of Victoria-based organizations that are part of the Destination Greater Victoria Network that are taking action on climate change. This presentation is made possible by Destination Greater Victoria and the Victoria Conference Center, who have partnered to provide carbon literacy and climate awareness training for event agencies, meeting planners, and tourism operators in collaboration with Synergy Enterprises. Before we begin, I'd like to pass it over to Sarah Falabolita, the Business Research and Sustainability Specialist at Destination Greater Victoria, to share a few words. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thank you, Christian. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Sarah. Yeah, we're working with Synergy as well as obviously the Victoria Conference Center to try and provide some deeper knowledge on climate change topics, just so that you can have all the tools that you need to try and learn about these areas and make it a little bit more accessible for you to apply knowledge towards, climate leadership. I'm really excited to hear what Synergy has planned for us today. And we have another session next week, same time as well. So stay tuned for that one. Over back to you, Christian.
So thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much for just being a driving force to getting everyone here together. I'm sure there's lots of value that we can gain from just this information that we're sharing today, but also potentially lots of value that we can gain from just sharing our thoughts and insights in terms of like how each of us are looking at climate change and some of those components with regards to sustainability. So thank you to you, Sarah, and thank you to the Destination Greater Victoria team and the Victoria Conference team as well for enabling these workshops as well. Now, as we get started, we wanted to just share a few housekeeping notes. Before we dive in, we ask that you please mute your microphone to help keep background noise to a minimum. We will have some engagement questions and some Q&A in between, but for the majority of the presentation where we will be sharing some of this information, we ask that you please remain muted to avoid any feedback happening across. If you are experiencing any technical issues, you may please try logging out and logging back in. Feel free to use the chat box as well to engage, ask questions, or share any thoughts as well that you may have. And lastly, I'd like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and you will be receiving a copy of this video recording as well as the presentation itself, so you can refer to it at a later time. Or if you are watching this as a brand new watcher, as it will be made publicly available, you are welcome to review this information at any time whatsoever. If you are not comfortable feeling recorded today, you are welcome to turn your camera off and maintain it like that for the rest of the presentation. We would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We are truly grateful to be able to live, work, and play on these lands, while also learning from our traditional hosts who have been stewards of these lands for generations. To kick things off, I would like to introduce myself and my colleague who will be facilitating today's session. My name is Christian, and I am a Senior Project Manager at Synergy Enterprises. And joining me today, moderating the backend, is Kayla Klim, Project Coordinator at Synergy. At Synergy Enterprises, we believe that businesses have the opportunity and the responsibility to impact global change, empower climate action, and lead the world towards a regenerative future and sustainable future for all. We work with leading organizations to mobilize climate action by measuring their carbon emissions or their carbon footprint, setting carbon reduction targets, creating decarbonization strategies, and implementing solutions towards reducing their own emissions and communicating those results to staff, guests, and the community. Synergy has been very fortunate to work with many organizations across the tourism sector, many of which are part of the Destination Greater Victoria Network. Some of these organizations you may recognize, including a few such as Inner Laurel Point and Parkside, BC's first and second carbon neutral hotels, Big Bull Burger, who was the first carbon neutral fast food restaurant in Canada, and Eagle Wing Tours, offering carbon neutral whale watching expeditions since operations began in 2005. We also work with leading organizations all across Canada, but a common theme across all of these organizations is that they are all climate leaders on their field, going above and beyond what is required of them as an organization to be a positive force for change. We have already done some introductions, and I have seen that there's a couple of more people that have put their introductions in the chat. If you have not had the opportunity to put in the chat just who you are, where you're joining us from, and which your organization you're representing, please do let us know, as we would like to learn more about you, especially what are some of the sustainability topics perhaps, or some questions that have come across that you're thinking like, oh, like I've heard about climate change, or I've heard about carbon neutrality, but I would like to learn more about what this concept means. If there's any of those ideas as well that come to mind, do please feel free to share those in the chat as we go through the presentation. Now we are going to jump right into the main content of our presentation today. First, starting with understanding the impacts and opportunities of climate change in tourism. First, we'd like to encourage each of us to take a moment to reflect on this question. How have you or someone you know of perhaps been impacted by climate change? Here in British Columbia, we have been experiencing the severe effects of those natural disasters caused by climate change. Wildfires, droughts, heavy rains, and floods have caused immeasurable damage across countless communities across BC. From your own personal experiences or through your own work in the tourism industry, can you think of any examples of how climate change has affected you, someone you know of, or your own organization? And when we talk about climate change, it is important to understand what climate change is and what the main drivers are behind it. Climate change refers to long-term changes to global temperatures and weather patterns. These changes can be either natural, for example, from the variation in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions, or these changes can be anthropogenic, meaning that they are caused by human activities. Climate change is driven by a number of factors, some including climate variability, which involves changing seasons and warmer weather patterns. As we see more extreme weather events, those affect the ocean currents and trade winds, which thus amplify climate variability, creating more extreme weather conditions. On the more anthropogenic or the human activity drivers, land use changes due to resource extraction, think of mining or deforestation, impacting ecosystems like forest, wetlands, and peatlands. These ecosystems are critical because forests, wetlands, and peatlands sequester and store significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And thus, the disturbance of these systems and the reduced capacity for these systems to absorb that carbon from the atmosphere results in a significant amount of carbon being released into the atmosphere. At the same time, human activities have exponentially increased the release of greenhouse gases, or GHGs. These greenhouse gases absorb and re-emit infrared radiation from the Earth's surface, much of this energy which remains in the Earth's atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect. And we'll see a diagram that showcases the effects of greenhouse gases in just a moment here. As we look at those greenhouse gases are atmospheric gases that absorb infrared radiation. The most common greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, which we often see through transportation, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons, which are often seen through refrigeration systems, methane through the burning of fuels such as natural gas, nitrous oxide through agricultural practices, nitrogen trifluoride through the manufacturing of microelectronics, and sulfur dioxide from electrical utilities as a couple of examples for the most common greenhouse gases that we see. And these greenhouse gases, as they're being released into the atmosphere, these gases will continue to absorb infrared radiation and trap that energy within the Earth's atmosphere for hundreds of years to come, more than what our current systems can do to absorb those gases. There will always be a constant flux or exchange of energy happening both inside and outside of the Earth's atmosphere. So we can see from this diagram, for example, solar radiation travels from the sun to the Earth. Some of that radiation is reflected by the Earth and the atmosphere. However, what we see is that most of the radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface, which warms our planet. Some infrared energy is radiated from the Earth's surface, some of which passes through our atmosphere. However, some of it is absorbed and re-radiated in all directions by greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere, which further warm the Earth and lower the atmosphere. What we're seeing is that the natural and human activities are changing the balance of energy in the atmosphere. And thus, the more heat-trapping greenhouse gases are released, such as carbon dioxide and the other ones we saw in the slide before, the more warming we'll see in our planet. But what does a warming planet mean? And how does this affect the Earth? This is a statistic from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is particularly helpful in understanding the impacts that 1 to 2 degrees of warming could have on our planet. For every 1 degree that the planet warms, we see 7% more moisture in our atmosphere. If we get to 2 degrees, that is 14% more moisture in the atmosphere. That is 14% less in our rivers and streams, and 14% more in our storms. This in turn translates to stronger storms, atmospheric rivers, heat domes, polar vortexes, and severe weather events that are likely to increase in number and density as the planet continues to warm. Scientific consensus has shown that we must reduce global emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. At a national level, what we're seeing is that no single country is on track to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, which is to hold warming well below 2 degrees and making efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. According to the Climate Action Tracker, which tracks government action and measures it against the Paris Agreement targets, Canada is currently sitting as highly insufficient to meet these targets. Thus, we still have a lot of work to do. And this is why we need all hands on deck. And a really significant driver as to why we're having this discussion today, to truly grasp how collective change can lead to a positive climate impact and a positive impact on our planet as well. So how does this impact the tourism industry? Studies suggest that the travel and tourism sector accounts for approximately 8 to 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. As one might expect, transportation emissions are a large part of the carbon footprint of global tourism. However, there are other areas involved in the total footprint, such as lodging, agriculture, food and beverage, retail, and more, where actions can be made to reduce emissions. Some of the impacts of climate change on tourism organizations include changing travel patterns. As temperatures change and some areas are more affected by climate change than others, travelers may change their patterns and where they choose to visit. Tourism activities are also affected by rising temperatures and weather events. For example, skiing destinations, which are experiencing warmer temperatures and less snow. Infrastructure and property that is needed for tourism, such as roads or bridges, may be damaged by extreme weather events such as flooding or fires. Destinations that rely on unique biodiversity to attract visitors may find that it is being affected by climate change as species move to adjust to climate impacts. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events as well are increasing, as seen by longer wildfire seasons and heat domes in British Columbia that affect the visitor experience and pose risk to both residents and tourists as well. Lastly, what we're seeing with an increase in costs for food, energy, and water consumption, which does ultimately impact business decisions as well. Consumer expectations are changing as travelers become more conscious of their environmental impact. Recent studies from Booking.com and the IBM Institute for Business Value show that travelers want to travel more sustainably and would like to see more transparent information about how the experiences that they are engaging with, how are they making a positive impact and contribution to the planet and the community as well. This, of course, leads to opportunities for the tourism industry to take action and adapt to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change and changing traveler patterns. The tourism industry can adapt to changing consumer patterns and cater to travelers that are seeking a more sustainable and regenerative experience to truly feel like they are making a positive contribution to the experience that they're engaging with. Businesses can also attract and retain talent for those that are seeking work where they feel that their sustainability values are being upheld and that they are contributing to positive change as well. Businesses can also adopt energy and water reduction initiatives to help not only on reduce costs, but also reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted to the atmosphere. Many businesses can also take advantage of grants and fundings related to electrification, renewable energy, and hiring to help in the implementation of many of the actions that would be relevant for your own organization. So many opportunities to lean on, as well as many different frameworks on how to advance sustainability and sustainable development within your own organization as well. One framework is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as an example. This framework provides a holistic approach for sustainable development and the role that tourism can play to reverse global warming and take action on climate change, as seen by SDG 13 on the left side of the screen, but also the role that tourism can play to protect biodiversity, address hunger and poverty in the regions, and truly maximize tourism's socioeconomic contribution towards sustainable development. Now that we have explored some of the impacts and opportunities of climate change, we wanted to highlight a few businesses, particularly in the Destination Greater Victoria network, that are taking positive steps towards climate action. And as we're sharing these examples with you, I know there's many here in the call as well who are taking great action in their own respective organizations, like Prince of Wales, towards climate action. So if there's any examples that you have also done within your organization that you're particularly proud of, or anything that stands out, please do let us know in the chat. This is the best way that we can learn about how we can best take collective action by leaning from each other's strengths as well. But for the case studies that we'll be sharing today, we will first start with an accommodation business example, being Huntingdon Hotel and Suites. Huntingdon has a goal to reduce and divert 80% of their waste from the landfill by replacing bottled water in rooms with reusable water bottles, removing single-use amenities in rooms, and replacing all single-use products from their buffet breakfast with bulk items. They estimate reducing an average of 34,000 single-use bottles per year from going into the landfill, which at the same time also ensures that fewer greenhouse gas emissions are being released into the atmosphere. Huntingdon has also introduced an eco-fund as an opportunity for their guests to join their sustainability journey. Guests would have the opportunity to contribute $2.50 per room and night to this eco-fund to help fund significant carbon initiatives at the hotel. Since introducing this eco-fund in 2021, Huntingdon has implemented projects involving a full transition to LED across the facility, as well as replacing their boilers with highly efficient models to further reduce their energy consumption and reduce their carbon emissions. Lastly, with 2 restaurants on site, Huntingdon has committed to reducing its overall food waste by 50% by 2030, undertaking initiatives such as composting their coffee and tea waste, which is repurposed in their own gardens, adjusting their menus and repurposing any surplus prep food into new menu items, investing in staff training and guest awareness, and recently also partnering with the Too Good To Go app to sell surplus food back to the community. So many examples of how organizations can look at not only addressing waste, but also implementing carbon initiatives. Another highlight organization includes Onion, a circular economy fashion company based in BC. Onion creates their clothing from entirely recycled natural fiber textiles from landfills with a deep focus on circularity. All products are manufactured here locally in Canada, contributing to enhancing local jobs and communities. And for them, where discarded clothing ends, their textile sourcing begins. They estimate that 80 to 90 pounds of textiles are thrown away per person each year. And thus, their designers consider this afterlife of the product and focus on creating timeless pieces that will be reworn and withstand tear, thereby reducing the environmental impact as these products won't be disposed of as quickly. And the last example that we wanted to share with you today is a restaurant, Big Will Burger, another highlighter organization with numerous locations across Vancouver Island. Big Will Burger was Canada's first carbon neutral fast food restaurant, which means that they have been measuring, reducing, and offsetting their carbon footprint for more than 10 years. They have also ensured that 95% of their waste is diverted from the landfills by using 100% compostable packaging for all of their meals, as well as introducing recyclable materials like the receipt papers through EcoChip. All food scraps and excess packaging become compost that is then used in their Food Eco District community gardens, and even going to the step of making their own biodiesel to power their company van as well. Hopefully you feel inspired by some of those businesses that are taking significant actions towards enhancing sustainability, not only within their own operations, but also within our community here in Victoria as well. Before we move on, we wanted to open the floor for any questions or highlights from the audiences. Were there any highlights that stood out to you just from the initial information provided so far, the case studies, or perhaps anything that you might have also implemented in your own organization that you would be interested to share? We do have 5 minutes or so of engagement before we move to the next portion of the presentation. So I wanted to open it up for discussion in general. If anybody would like to unmute and chime in or use the chat as well. And I am just going through the chat, which it looks like it has been pretty active. Thank you, everyone, for providing some of your introductions. Emma, Gita, pleasure to have you join us today. Tink as well. Jules, Jade. But if anyone would like to share any insights as well or any questions, yes, feel free to use the chat. Otherwise, we can move on right to the next portion of the presentation, seeing that there are no hands up. And now we wanted to cover a few key concepts that will help you understand how an organization can take tangible actions to measure and reduce their carbon emissions within the context of reducing greenhouse gases. First, starting with what is a carbon footprint? How, as an organization, can I understand the environmental impact of my business operations? When we use the term carbon footprint, we are referring to the total amount of carbon emissions that are produced from an organization's activities. This is calculated by taking the activities such as how much fuel you're burning for heating your facilities, or perhaps if you're a restaurant, how much fuel you're burning for your grills. And we multiply those activities with an established emissions factor that will result in the total carbon dioxide equivalent amount or the total carbon footprint for your organization. This carbon footprint is calculated within an established boundary and for a clear scope. Emission scopes are broken down into 3 categories. Scope 1 being direct emissions that are defined as emissions combusted on site or in company vehicles. This can include natural gas, gasoline, propane, marine diesel, or refrigerants. Scope 2 being indirect emissions from electricity, which are the emissions that are combusted off-site for heating and cooling, lighting, and electrical appliances. And finally, there is Scope 3, which includes other indirect emissions from sources such as business travel. How often are you visiting different destinations to either engage in business engagements or promote your organization? How much paper you're purchasing for your business operations? How much waste is being produced overall throughout all facilities? How are people commuting to and from work? Many different areas with regards to scope 3, but purpose of a scope and boundary setting activity by itself is to really determine as a first step, what are the appropriate sources for your organization and which are not. Once an organization measures their carbon footprint, they have the option to then become carbon neutral. Being carbon neutral means that you have a net zero carbon footprint, or that for every ton of carbon that you produce, you ensure that same amount of carbon is offset. You can think of it as an equation where the more that you produce on one side, the more that you need to offset. The less that you produce, the less you need to offset. So carbon neutrality is achieved when a business offsets the impact of their carbon footprint by investing in verified carbon projects that mitigate or remove that same amount of carbon as the operations produced. In doing so, the businesses ensure that they are not contributing additional greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere and therefore have a net zero carbon impact. To touch upon carbon offsets just very briefly, carbon offsets are investments made in projects that help reduce, remove, or prevent future greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere. A company will purchase carbon offsets to neutralize their carbon impact from operations. Some examples of common carbon offsets include offset projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as transitioning to renewable energy, removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere, either by planting trees as an example, or preventing future greenhouse gas emissions through forestry conservation, and really ensuring that those systems that are in place can sequester as much carbon as possible from the atmosphere. The purchase offset provides financial support to projects that may not have a great financial return, but do have a great environmental benefit. And by doing this, they can help accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy as well. So to summarize, there are 3 steps to measuring carbon neutrality. The first step is to measure all of your business operation emissions that result in a carbon footprint. It's really taking a moment to understand, as a business, what are those emission sources that are applicable to my organization? Do I burn a lot of fuel? Do I have company vehicles that run on gasoline and diesel? As a manufacturer, do I do any shipping to consumers nationally or internationally as well? Does my organization perform a lot of business travel where team members represent our organization in different conferences and events? Truly, the first step is to identify what are those emission sources that are most relevant to your organizations to help you identify and measure the carbon footprint for your organization. The next step is the step that at Synergy we recommend the most, which is reduce. Really taking the moment to identify opportunities in your business to reduce your emissions in various areas such as energy use, fuel use, or transportation. Now that you have measured your emissions, what are the next steps? How, as an organization, are you going to plan to engage your team and identify actions to help reduce emissions over time? And then the last step is offsetting your carbon emissions by supporting a carbon offset project that aligns with the mission and values of your organization. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of carbon offset projects, both locally and internationally, and different carbon offset providers that provide a wide range of projects. But often our recommendation is to really dive deep into projects that truly feel like they make the most impact to you and that resonate with the values of you and your organization as well. And as we define the steps of achieving carbon neutrality, it is equally important to define the step towards achieving net zero emissions, which is more of a long-term target. We have been hearing more and more of, and as we mentioned previously earlier in the presentation, that there's that collective action towards achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We're seeing this across national, global levels, as well as industry levels, where many organizations are aiming to achieve net zero. How is it different from carbon neutrality? Achieving net zero essentially requires deep reductions in emissions. Think 90 to 95% reductions to your carbon footprint, to a point where, as an organization and day-to-day practices and current technologies, there's no further room for reduction. In this scenario, for achieving net zero, you reduce your baseline emissions as far as possible, and then look at removing residual emissions directly, either through direct reforestation project investments in direct reforestation projects, or by purchasing removals from third parties. So this aspect of carbon removal can be done through, for example, carbon capture and storage solutions, which involve capturing carbon dioxide before it enters the atmosphere, transporting it and storing it, or through direct investments in preserving and protecting carbon sinks, such as forests, peatlands, oceans, these systems that absorb significantly more carbon than they produce, and ensuring that these systems are not reduced within their capacity for absorbing their carbon. The main distinction that you can think of when thinking about becoming carbon neutral versus becoming net zero is that you are not really relying on carbon offsets when you're aiming to achieve net zero, as much as you're relying on carbon offsets to achieve carbon neutrality. Rather, when you are aiming to achieve net zero, you are directly investing in projects that directly sequester and store carbon from the atmosphere. To conceptualize this a bit further, we have developed this diagram to describe the journey that organizations can take to measure their carbon footprint, reduce their emissions, achieve carbon neutrality, and achieve net zero. Or to keep it more concise, the decarbonization journey of an organization. In this chart, you will see that, for example, the yellow line represents an organization's baseline carbon footprint. At any point, the organization can measure their baseline emissions and achieve carbon neutrality. So let's say, for example, you decide to measure your carbon emissions in your first year, and you're measuring, let's say, your 2023 operations. At that point, you can purchase carbon offsets and achieve carbon neutrality right away. However, what we are seeing and what we are recommending is really looking at investing in deep reduction opportunities, seeing what are some of the actions year by year where you can reduce 30 to 70% of your carbon footprint, either through design and operational choices, through engaging the team, through changing suppliers, for example. How do you reduce your emissions as much as possible, which also in hand, if the goal is to also become carbon neutral, you would pay less in offsets. As let's say year 2, you reduce your emissions by 5%, year 3, you reduce your emissions by 10%, and thus leading to fewer costs in offsets. Once you get to a point where there's only as much as you can feasibly do with completing all of the actions from your action planning or through current technologies and not having they're not being as feasible to implement some solutions within your organizations for the moment, there will be that residual amount of carbon due to the nature of those day-to-day operations. But as technologies advance and as we're seeing more evolving guidelines and practices towards those direct investments in carbon sinks and carbon capture and storage solutions, what we're seeing is that more organizations are aiming towards becoming net zero or net negative through those direct investments as well. This is another model that can also help showcase the decarbonization journey of an organization. This is the decarbonization pathway that is more to be a multi-year process to guide organizations in that aspect of measuring, managing, and reducing your emissions. So as kind of noted in the previous one as well, the first year is where you would look at creating your baseline carbon footprint. And before even getting into purchasing carbon offsets, really taking the dedicated time and resources to identify, now that we have an understanding of our baseline, what are going to be the actions that we're going to take to reduce our emissions. We have noted that perhaps 90% of our carbon footprint comes from the fuel that we use in our vehicles and machinery. How feasible is it to start electrifying some of that equipment or look at other solutions, or even before even switching to equipment, can we optimize our equipment as much as possible so it doesn't procure as much fuel? Or if, for example, travel is a significant aspect of your carbon footprint, how can you encourage more virtual events, or limiting travel, or taking more environmentally friendly means of transportation like busing, trains, etc. So really looking at, from all of the carbon emissions and the most material or significant emissions in your operations, what are some of those strategies to help you reduce your carbon footprint year over year? Engaging your team also goes a long way, not only towards identifying actions that teams perhaps may see. So for example, if you own a restaurant or a hotel that offers catering, do your staff have ideas on, we see this much volume of compost waste that we believe could be saved through these means, for example. So really engaging your team goes a long way towards getting ideas, and also making them feel like they're also part of this journey towards enhancing sustainability within the operations. From there, action planning and implementation. At this point, this should become an annual process where you implement your annual actions. You determine we're going to focus on these specific actions for the next 6 months and for the next year. Check in a year from now, how have we progressed towards our goals? What's next on our action plan? How are we going to plan to implement it? As we measure our carbon footprint in the second year, having implemented all these actions, what is the difference between the first year that we measured our emissions to the second year that we measured? Did we see a decrease in emissions? Did we see an increase perhaps of an uptick in business operations? What else does the data show us? From there, and at any point, you can become a carbon neutral organization. You can become a carbon neutral organization the first year that you measure your emissions, the second year that you measure. This should be an annual process where you're looking at that aspect of how are we going to continue to decarbonize or reduce the emissions from our business operations. So this decarbonization pathway is what we often recommend and what we often see as an annual process for many of the clients that we work with and many of the organizations that are taking action towards understanding their carbon footprint and reducing emissions for their operations, as well as enhancing sustainability within the community that they operate in.